Hi, friends. Welcome to the Genesis of Shame podcast. I'm your host, Sam Landa, and I'm here to help you speak biblical truth to the shame you experience in relationships. My hope is that you grow in your understanding of how shame impacts you so you can learn how to connect with God and others. If you've experienced fear, hiding who you are, boundary issues, anxiety, and/or depression in your relationships, then this podcast is for you. It's time to speak truth to your shame. Well, hello everyone. Welcome back to the Genesis of Shame podcast. This is an episode. I haven't done an interview in an episode by myself in quite a while. So it feels a little weird just kind of being here and trying to record this by myself because I've done a bunch of interviews. But it also feels good because the preparation for these topics that we're about to discuss are very, very important. So a couple of weeks ago, actually, I was asking for some questions that you guys may have about relationships. And one of the ones that came up was shame in relationships and how to discuss that, right? Because when we enter relationships, we often don't address issues that we should be addressing. And part of that has to do with shame. You know, as I've thought about shame more and more, there's two ways that people tend to respond when they feel shame over something, right? So one of them is hiding, right? And we see this in the Garden of Eden, and this was actually how the podcast kind of came into being. I was trying to find a research focus for a dissertation topic, and shame kind of came to mind. And as I was reading through the scriptures, starting in Genesis, we see obviously the shame of Adam and Eve after sinning against God. And they hid and they covered themselves. And that is one of the main responses in which we as Christians tend to, not just Christians, even non-Christians, tend to do, right? We hide ourselves. We hide the true nature of who we are. And that can be for a variety of reasons, but one of them is obviously because of sin from our lives. Another reason could be just not trusting other people in our circles. Again, you don't have to share with everyone, but finding safe people is important. And, just knowing our past, or just making mistakes in our past and not being able to recover from that. So it's very, very important to understand what this looks like in relationships. Okay, but one of them is we hide from each other. And secondly, we overshare, right? We overshare who we are so that we can it's kind of like a release. It's an emotional release of this shame that I'm experiencing. So sometimes when you enter into a relationship, you will tend to overshare, and you're oversharing because you want to feel better about that anxiety or that thing that you're ashamed about. And sometimes that can push some people away, either because they're not ready to hear something so deep or so intimate about someone else, or just because it can be awkward, right? Sometimes it's awkward when someone just shares their whole life story, but specifically focusing on the negative. And again, when you're dealing with shame, people overshare to relieve themselves of some of that weight, that shameful weight. So what does this look like in relationships? And we will jump into that now. So as always, if you have not subscribed to the podcast, please do so now. I will really, really appreciate that. And guys, this is episode 50. Like, this is a big deal. Like, I'm really excited about this, and hopefully you guys find value from today's episode. And I'm going to have another one next week, and I have some other interviews lined up. But if you've been tuning in, and if you've been here listening up until this point, I just want to say thank you. Thank you, because, every once in a while, I'm assuming this happens to a lot of podcasters, but every once in a while, you just kind of feel a little discouraged because maybe you're not seeing the growth that you'd want to see, or maybe you feel like you're running out of topics, or maybe you feel like no one really cares about this topic. Whatever the case is, you just kind of go through those moments of uncertainty and insecurity of how you're doing and so on. But whenever I get a message or a text or a question about something that you guys are experiencing in your life, which I really, really enjoy. I think that's just the teacher inside of me. I just love it. So it keeps me going. This is episode 50. I'm going to celebrate it. Hopefully you guys are able to celebrate it along with me, especially if you've been tuning in for a good while. But thank you again for tuning in, and hopefully you guys find today's episode to be a blessing. So the topic for today, shame in romantic relationships. Okay, shame in romantic relationships. And what does this mean? Okay, so when I was asking for some questions, I have to give a shout out to Taylor. And she asked something, and she asked a good number of these questions. But one of them that I think is important to address is, what does it look like when you have to ask about each other's history, right? About each other's past. And there is some difficult conversation around this, because if you guys remember, a number of years ago, I don't know how long ago, but there was a time where the ideal for a man in entering into a relationship was that he was hoping that he would marry a virgin. And this was kind of the epitome of a relationship. And I'm going to guess that also from a female perspective, that husband or that a man also saved himself for her. So for her, it would be to marry someone who is also a virgin. And for whatever reason, and I do see this does happen, where the expectation is more so for women. It's more acceptable for men to be promiscuous and do whatever they want. And I'm talking about culturally acceptable, okay, not biblically acceptable, okay? So culturally, it seems to be that it's a lesser offense if a man is playing around, messing around, sleeping with all types of women. It's seen as a lesser offense. It's seen as this is just the thing that guys do. But from a biblical perspective, we are not supposed to do that. We're supposed to save ourselves, protect our bodies, protect our minds, so that when we get married, we can enter that relationship without that type of shame, right? But also to be a blessing, right? There's something special about being obedient to God and protecting your body like that. So that is for both men and for women. But like I said, culturally, if women were to sleep around, or if they've had a past where they have had sex in a relationship, it has a more negative connotation to it, right? And typically when you do find that with women, Christian women, if that is part of their history, you usually find that in longer term relationships. Not that that makes it any more acceptable. That doesn't mean that there also aren't relationships where maybe in trying to find meaning, they would find their value from having men sleep with them, which is also a possibility. And the same thing goes for men. Men try to find value in themselves by sleeping with many women, right? Because that raises their status among other men. Now, I want to be careful here, because there's a difference between Christian men, or at least there should be a difference between Christian men and non-Christian men. As you know, this podcast is for Christians, so I'm speaking specifically to Christian men. So what does it look like then to talk about your past with someone that you are dating, or someone that you are looking to get married to, wanting to propose, and then eventually get married? So what does it look like to talk about your past history, and specifically sexual history? But I want to go even deeper than that, right? Sexual history, you're going to ask about, how many relationships have you had? They might say, I've had tons of relationships. Then you might ask, how long were those relationships? What was your longest relationship? Just to gain some information about the person, to know whether or not they are willing or able to commit, right? That's part of asking about this relationship history. If someone has been dating a lot but can't seem to keep a boyfriend or girlfriend for longer than 3 months, then most likely that will be a red flag for someone. If in every single relationship the person was cheating, again, that's probably another red flag for someone. And no one likes to share that, right? And that's part of the shame, right? As you explore your sexual history with the other person and trying to figure out whether or not you want to enter a relationship with them, you will ask these tough questions, or at least we should ask these tough questions, right? Some people take the approach of being more lighthearted early on and not really get too serious too soon, and that's fair. I understand the reasoning behind that, right? If we get too serious when I don't even know if I really want to date you or marry you, I don't know if I want to ask these tough questions early on. And others might say, well, and this plays a huge role with age. So the older you are, the more serious you are. The younger you are, the less serious you are about making these decisions. But anyways, if you are looking to get married, and if you are a little bit older, so I would say 25 plus, you might be more serious about this, and you might want to knock this out of the conversation early on. So you talk about these things. Maybe you become friends and you start exploring and understanding where you guys stand on certain issues, and again, what this relationship history is like, right? So the sex is just one aspect, but really what we're digging for, or what people are digging for, is trying to figure out is if this is someone who I can see myself marrying. Are they dependable? Are they willing to work through issues? What happened in those previous relationships that pushed them to do things that they weren't supposed to, right? So really, the sex is just one aspect, right? That's after all the other stuff. So if you do start talking about sexual history, how do you talk about it? Like, do you give details? I mean, this is someone that obviously you're considering dating, remember, or you're considering to marry. So for a conversation like this, obviously it's hard to jump into it right away. If you're thinking about dating someone, again, you're free to ask any question that you want to ask, okay? And I think sometimes we feel scared or don't think that that's right to do. But you're the one who's entering the relationship. You should have the right, and I don't even like using that word specifically, but you should have the ability and the freedom to ask questions about that person's relationship in their past history. I think that's fair. And they're also free to not answer, okay? And that gives a certain status to the relationship. Okay, so I want to know this information. You don't want to give me this information. Okay, what do we do here? So now you have to make a decision. Do I want to pursue this relationship? Well, remember, the first thing in any relationship, there's always this physical attraction, right? And then it's starting to get to know the person. Maybe you like their personality. You like how they treat other people. There's a lot of things that that draw us to this person that you may be interested in. So you can ask these questions. Ask the tough questions. Now, if you're getting married, or if you're planning to get married, I would definitely recommend asking these questions. I'm always surprised by how many people don't actually have these discussions. How many kids do you want to have? Where do you want to live? Where do you see yourself in 5-10 years from now? And to be fair, you don't always know, but you should have a good, solid idea of what you want, especially in these older ages, right? So something to think about. So how do you talk about sexual history? What I would say is first start talking about their relationship history. And that'll actually give you more patterns to be aware of. Because the hope is that you're not dating someone or interested in someone who has had multiple sexual partners and has been sleeping around, right? Most likely, that's not someone that you're looking for. So maybe for you, it's basically a process of elimination. If you knew that they are, or that they have been sleeping around and they're not fully repented from that and they're still, messing around, then obviously for you, it's kind of like the red light. No, I'm not going to pursue this, right? So in that sense, exploring the sexual history makes a lot of sense. I don't want to deal with someone who's still sleeping around and thinks that that's going to happen in this relationship. So that's good. But if it is someone that you're interested in, usually you don't get to those tough topics until later on. So ask about the relationship, their past relationships. Ask about how long they lasted. Ask about what happened, right? You only have one perspective. And you also have to go by, ask God for wisdom. As this person shares, we tend to present the best version of ourselves, right? When someone wants to know about us, we tend to present the best version of ourselves. And remember, they're also paying attention to you. They're also going to ask you questions. So sometimes, here's something that I do see play out. Sometimes we don't ask those tough questions because we don't want those questions to be asked of us. right? When you have a lot of shame over decisions that you've made in your past, we don't like that. We don't like the idea that someone could ask us the same questions and make us feel uncomfortable in that. So that is why we tend to avoid those questions. We don't want people to ask us the same thing. So it's very interesting to see how that plays out. Now, if you've dealt with your shame, you're more open to asking those questions, right? You've processed, you've discussed it with a friend, with a pastor, a counselor, someone, and you've healed from it, right? So you feel comfortable asking those questions, and you will feel kind of comfortable, a little uncomfortable maybe, if they ask you those questions. But you have to be willing to go there, because that is something that does play a role into how you and this person will have a relationship. Okay, so talking about sexual history is always interesting, because one person has to be willing to go there. And again, depending on what your goal is for the relationship, you'll decide to go there sooner, or you might decide to go there later. Okay, so that's just one aspect of what it looks like to talk about sexual history. And another question could be, how do I become vulnerable in a relationship, right? How do I feel heard, loved, safe, and not shamed by someone else's response to my story, to my life? Now, the hope is that no one is still living in this way, right? So if you do find out about their relationship history and it was horrible, or their sexual history and it was pretty expansive, you're going to have some pause. You're not going to want to maybe pursue that relationship. But then, whenever you've shared your story, and especially in Christian circles, and you've been shamed for it, right? What does that do? It just makes you want to hide more, right? Until you're ready to release again, right? So there's people who will hide and hide and hide and hide. And then once they find someone who's safe, they let everything out, right? All of that shame, they just share it all with this person, and they feel heard, they feel safe. But what it does is, again, the purpose of that was to relieve themselves of all that pressure of emotions and stuffing down that shame. That's what's happening, right? So we have to be very careful. We have to have safe people around us to be able to share when we feel those shameful thoughts and feelings. Oftentimes when we think about vulnerability, we think about it's just sharing how I feel. But it's sharing more than that. It's not just sharing how you feel, but it's also sharing what you think and what you wish for and what your future looks like, right? Because at any point, anytime that you share that, the person can choose in that moment not to move forward. So, for example, I talk about the 3 F's in relationships that you need to have a discussion over, and it's faith, family, and future. You need to talk about your faith. So let's say that you are a Southern Baptist, grew up in the church, servant heart, always in activities at church, right? And you have another person who came to the Lord at a later time, and when they did, they've kind of been jumping around from church to church to see where it is that they actually land. So they've tried Catholic church, they've tried a Mormon church, they've tried a Baptist church, Pentecostal church. So they're trying all of these different denominations and don't really know where they land. Or maybe they land in a Pentecostal church, right? And that's not to say that Pentecostals aren't Christian, but if you grew up Baptist and you are interested in someone who is Pentecostal, there's going to be some issues, right? There's going to be some conflict in regards to how you view your faith and how you view growing in Christ. So those are things to pay attention to, right? You want your faith to line up. Obviously, being believers by accepting Christ as Lord and Savior, that's one part of it, right? So just the fact that you both are Christian and have received the Lord, that's not enough depth to build a relationship on, right? You have to know what your habits are, because what if one of you guys likes to go to church every single week, Monday, Wednesday, and the other person goes once a month, and that for them is enough? There's going to be conflict there, right? And that's not healthy, right? That's part of being unequally yoked, as the Bible teaches, right, in Corinthians. So look for those things in faith. Do you guys enjoy meeting with other believers? I knew about a couple who, one of them enjoyed having people over the house, other believers, and they talk about faith and they talk about what the Lord is doing in their lives and so on, talk about their families. And then the other spouse, and this was a married couple, and the other spouse just hated it. So she just tolerated having people over all of the time. And she just tolerated the fact that they were talking about Christ and what he's doing in their lives. Right. So it wasn't something that was as meaningful for her as it was for the husband in this case. And sometimes that can be flipped. Right. Sometimes the wife is much more involved and much more engaged and wants to have people over, and the husband's more standoffish and doesn't really want anything to do with being involved in the process. Right. So whenever you have conflicts like that, you need to talk about faith. And again, this does bring up the issue of shame, right? Because you may hide that from the other person. You may say, well, I only go once a month. I won't say that right now. So they hide that, right? No, I try to go whenever I can. They use very vague terms. So again, when talking about faith, family, future, if they use a lot of vague terms, be careful, okay? Ask for clarity, because vagueness provides opportunity to shift here and there. Ask for clarity, ask for specificity. Don't be afraid to go there. One of the things I want to empower you guys to do is to ask those questions. Okay, better before marriage than after marriage, because then it becomes more of an issue after marriage. And I've seen it in a lot of relationships where these very difficult conversations are not had till after. I'm thankful that my wife and I were able to address some of these exact three, right? Faith, family, future. We wanted a big family. We grew up Baptist. We were involved in the church. Future-wise, I wanted to go into teaching at the college level, and she wanted to raise our kids. So all of those things just started to line up. And for us, that was a huge plus that led us down the path to marriage. And then when you're married, then you have to discover other things, right? And work through some other issues which come up. So all of those things are important to discuss early on. So we talked about faith, family, talk about family of origins, right? Who are you in the family? Are you the firstborn? Are you the middle child? Are you the last one born? What does that look like? How did you behave with your family? And this is one of the things where I encourage each person in the relationship to see how they are with their families, because that's going to be what you're going to see, right? That is who they are when they're with their families, when they're with their close friends. That is who they are, right? So I talk about that. I talk about how they respond under stress. That is how you also find out who they are. How does this person respond when they're under pressure? That's going to tell you a little bit about their character. And as you see other instances like that, then you can start building even more and more of a fuller view of who this person is and how they are in those stressful times, because you will encounter that in marriage. Okay, so you have faith, you have family, and then you have future. Where are you guys going, right? Where do you want to go? Again, going back to the idea of shame, is that one person may be called to the mission field and the other person doesn't want to go to the mission field. They can't even fathom the idea of going on a mission trip or going to, a foreign country. Right? So your future, if that's what it entails, it's going to be tough, right? That's not wise to do that. What if one of you guys wants to be a lawyer or a doctor, and the time commitment to that, right? And for you, maybe one of your love languages is quality time. That's going to be rough, right? Because you have to understand that those professions require long hours and a large time commitment. Right? So can you handle that? Okay, so knowing your love language, knowing how to approach this talk about the future and where you want to go. Where do you see yourself? Do you want to stay home? Do you want to work? As a wife, as a husband, do you want to be involved father? And obviously, most of those are yeses, but the idea is, what does that look like? So when you talk about your future, again, be specific. What is it that you're looking for? That doesn't mean that is exactly how it's going to be, but it does give you a picture of what the other person wants. And you can assess their authenticity, in a sense, of what they're actually desiring. Like when they're sharing in person, and you see it throughout their lives, like what they're desiring for their future, you can observe other aspects of their lives that speak to that. Okay, if it's doctor wanting to be a doctor and they're great at science and they love it and they're just so committed to school and they're very disciplined, like that's what you're going to see. And obviously, as a doctor, it might be even less time commitment. And obviously, every couple works it out, right? Whatever works for them. They might have even, half a day to spend together, but that's fine. So just know yourself, talk about the future, talk about your families, and talk about your faith, okay? Shame has a way of moving us to hide that from each other, right? Maybe you want a big family and you're scared because that might scare him away, right? But if that's what you want and that's what you feel God is calling you to have, then share that with him, right? That's being vulnerable. Sharing what you desire, sharing what God has placed on your heart is part of being vulnerable, because the person can choose to listen or to ignore, and that makes us feel vulnerable. But if they accept and like, hey, I want the same thing, it's very encouraging to find someone who wants the same things that you want. Very cool. I think another point here to make has to deal with, I've been talking about vulnerability and what that looks like, but shame blocks vulnerability. And this is basically what we've been talking about this whole episode, is how shame moves you to hide who you really are or what you really desire, right? Because you're afraid that the other person will not want that. Okay, so that moves us into hiding. It pulls us back. We fear to be fully known. Part of being fully known is not just knowing the weaknesses and vulnerabilities, but also knowing the wants and desires, right? Like I was saying earlier. So to be fully known, right? One of the benefits that that Adam and Eve had in the garden was that they were fully known, not just by God, but each other. They were fully known to each other. They knew each other well. There was no barrier. There was no sin that would cause them to hide or to criticize each other, right? Or to use any of the four of Gottman's horsemen of the apocalypse, right? The criticism, contempt, defensiveness, or stonewalling. Like, they weren't doing that. There was no sin. But once sin entered the world, it created an immediate rift between husband and wife. And not just between husband and wife, but between human relationships, and also between our relationship with God. So shame prevents us from being vulnerable with each other. So we need to deal with that shame. But even more importantly, right, before you even get to this aspect of relationship talk, the biggest thing, and this is where we need to talk about shame more so, is our relationship with God. Right? Shame also moves us to want to hide from God, want to hide the worst parts of ourselves from God, even though intellectually we know that He knows and that He sees us for who we really are. But our minds and our bodies don't fully capture that, which is why when we do something wrong, we just ignore God, right? We don't pray, we don't read our Bible, we kind of avoid Him at all costs, not knowing that He's seen everything that's happening and He knows everything about us. How much better is it to just come to Him with hands wide open and head down in submission and just letting Him know, Lord, I need you. Take this away from me. And a lot of times we don't deal with our past because we're so ashamed. I'm not going to give a name, but knowing someone very close to me could feel really bad about a decision that he made years and years and years ago. And never having dealt with that shame, he continues to apologize, right? And there's people who do that today as well. It could be someone that who's hurt you from years ago, and they still keep apologizing, right? Even though you might say to them, I've already forgiven you. Maybe you have, maybe you haven't, but that's not the case here. Have they taken their offense before God, right? Have they dealt with the shame from that decision, right? What does David say in Psalm 51? He says, "Against you, you only have I sinned." Now, there's some people who don't like that. Well, no, he sinned against Uriah, he sinned against Bathsheba, and so and so. And he did, right? He knows that. But the offense, the primary offense, is against God, because God protects marriage and God protects people. So when David said, "I sinned only against you," he's saying that your law I have broken, right? Sin is an offense to law, a breaking of God's law. And that is ultimately what David is getting at. This doesn't mean that he didn't need to ask for forgiveness from Bathsheba, right? This doesn't mean that. And same thing in our human relationships. Just because we take something to God and we ask for his forgiveness and he forgives us, doesn't mean that we don't ask for forgiveness from the people that we ourselves hurt. Right? We still need to ask for forgiveness, because that is a commandment in the scriptures. There's something that God calls us to do as his followers, right? Forgive others as I also have forgiven you. And that is what we need to do. And what does Peter ask, right? He says, how many times? And the answer is what? 70 times 7. So it's 490 times. That's not what Jesus was getting at. But we all get the picture, right? Continue to forgive. And as you continue to forgive, that shame slowly dissipates. When we understand that God has taken the penalty for our sins, right, we appreciate that sacrifice much, much more, which is why we continue to battle against sin, right? We ask God for help when we feel tempted in order to deal with that shame from past decisions, giving that up to the Lord in prayer, in meditating on his word, right? Allowing for his word to cleanse our hearts. Okay. And if we can start there, then you can start being more vulnerable with people, right? And again, there's a couple of things that keep us from being vulnerable with people. One is that they're not safe. If a person is not safe and you feel that they're going to use that information against you, you most likely won't share. So that could be a reason. It might not be that you're afraid to show them who you are, but it could be that you're afraid of how they're going to use that information, right? So this is just a matter of wisdom. Who can I share this with? Is this person trustworthy? Well, they did these things back in their previous relationships. I don't know. And that's fair, right? That's why you gather that information. You see how they treat other people or what they say about other people. Well, if I share this with them and they're sharing this stuff about these other people with me, I don't know if I can trust that. That makes me a little hesitant, right? So what about if the person is not safe, though? Can you still share? Yeah, you can. You can. What are the repercussions of that? That they can use that information however they want? True. But then what? What does that mean? Basically, if you're healthily sharing the things that have caused you to be ashamed and you've given it to God, you sharing is that little release each time. As opposed to doing the opposite, which is sharing everything and overwhelming people with how much sin or how much guilt or how much pain you've had, right? Or not sharing anything at all, which is necessary for intimacy. So you don't share anything at all. You keep everything to yourself. And even though the other person might want to get close to you, they're asking questions about you, you won't be able to share because you haven't dealt with that shame. Again, shame will cause you to hide yourself or to overexpose yourself. Okay? And we want to find that healthy medium. And that only comes through the healing of understanding that God has forgiven those sins. You are now a new creature who is being sanctified through his work in your life. Okay? And that is how that shame slowly continues to dissipate. It's so innate for us to feel shame when people either say things about us or when we see our own humanity and weaknesses. So I want to encourage you, friends, that if you are dealing with shame, I hope that this episode was helpful for you, specifically in regards to relationships and how you can tackle these different topics. But yeah, if you have any questions or anything at all, I'm more than happy to answer any question that you have about shame or how to approach these relationships. Or I'm not an expert in any way on these things. This is something they do study a lot, shame in relationships or shame in general. So I do have that knowledge, but I don't consider myself an expert in any of this, really. I'm someone who wants to help people and wants to see their relationships do well. But more importantly, and most importantly, is that I see the gospel working in your life, that you accept the forgiveness of God, repent of your sins, and accept that forgiveness, and then allow Him to just start working from the inside out in your life. So thank you guys for tuning in. Again, this is episode 50, so I hope it was a blessing. I'm looking forward to the next ones. Hope you have a great day. See you next week. Bye.
Thank you again for tuning in today, guys. I really appreciate it. Your support means a lot to me, and I really look forward to doing these each and every week. If you would like to continue supporting the podcast, one of the things you can do is go to your Apple Podcast and find the Genesis of Shame there and then subscribe to it. That really helps Sig get some traction on the iTunes podcast and will allow this to be heard by many more people. You can also follow me on Spotify and other major podcast platforms. Thank you again, guys. Have a great day.